In this lesson, you'll learn about file types. When a digital camera takes a photo, it will save that photo as a digital file. You can change the type of file your camera saves in your camera settings. But what do those file types actually mean? And what are the advantages and disadvantages to each of them? Most camera systems will either save the photos as a JPEG or a RAW image. RAW images will be just what it sounds like. They're raw, in that they will preserve the native settings of the image. It will not be compressed or downsized or processed by any other setting in the camera. It will be the full resolution the sensor in your camera can produce without any loss or change in information. This means when you start to edit the file in post-production, you will have the maximum amount of information to change and edit as you see fit. RAW images will be bigger in file size and also look a bit flat out of the camera, which means less contrast and less saturation. We'll include a link to the supplemental resources of this section with a list of all the different RAW file types. For example, Canon RAW files are .cr2 files, while Nikon RAW files are .nef. Some cameras offer different sizes of RAW images. This doesn't affect the quality or compression, but the resolution of your image, the pixel width, and the height. Unlike RAW images, JPEG is a standard file type that most camera systems have. Shooting JPEGs will be the default for most cameras. A JPEG image is compressed and smaller in size than a RAW image. It's also a more universal file type that can be read by most computers, phones, and applications. JPEGs will tend to be processed a bit more by the camera as well, so they will have more saturation, they'll be a bit sharper, and have more contrast. Basically, they're the images that are ready to go right out of the camera. You may even have different options for how much JPEG images are compressed and what resolution you want to shoot in. This is usually represented in your menu by L, M, and S. L is the best quality, M is the middle, and S is the lowest. Large, medium, small. There might even be 2L or 2M and 2S options. The options with a curved symbol is a higher quality and does less compression than the stepped icon. Check out this demo about editing a RAW versus JPEG image.
Phil here, and I just want to show you the power of shooting in RAW. First, I'm in Lightroom, and don't worry about actually what I'm doing. I'll show you how to do this later in the editing sections of this course. You can pretty much increase the exposure or adjust the exposure of images with any editing application. So first, this is an image that I shot of my wife Isabel on her birthday at Huntington Gardens in Los Angeles, and it's so dark, and I just didn't have enough time to properly set my settings to expose. But because I was shooting in RAW, I can take an image like this and bring up the exposure. You can see that this photo has so much information that even in the shadows where this is how it shot it, we have enough information to be able to expose properly to my wife's face, which is the most important part of this image. While we do that, we can bring down the exposure of the background so that that information is still there and it's not completely overexposed. And this is what you can do with a RAW image: before, after, before, after. Now, to show you the difference between how you can edit JPEG versus RAW, here's another image shot on that day. I have the JPEG version and the RAW version. Way too overexposed. So what I would typically do is drop the exposure. Now this is of the JPEG photo. And again, I'm trying to expose to their face, which is the most important part. Here is about where their face is naturally exposed best. But look at the sky. It looks like there's like a shadow over the entire image. It just doesn't look that good. But when I do the same thing with the RAW photo, let me bring down the exposure until their faces are well exposed. Look at that. The sky looks a lot better. You just have way more information in the RAW photo. It looks way more natural. And I haven't even done any specific adjustments to the highlights or the shadows. This is just a general overall exposure increase or decrease. And you can see that by editing in RAW or having the RAW version, it gives you so much more room to play with.
There are pros and cons to shooting either of these formats, but as a general rule, shooting in RAW will get you the most out of your camera and photos. It is the preferred method for professional photographers because of just that. They get the most out of their camera. Most cameras will allow you to record in both JPEG and RAW formats, if you'd like. The benefit of doing this is so that you can quickly use the JPEG versions for reviewing, or sharing online. At the same time, you'll have the RAW version for archival purposes and editing later on. Here are some tips for shooting in RAW. We will always be shooting in RAW if we can. Here's an example of what a RAW image looks like straight out of the camera versus what a JPEG image looks straight out of the camera. You can see how the RAW image is more flat and ready for post-editing, while the JPEG image is already processed. When you shoot in RAW, you have to be prepared to edit your photos to make them the best they can be. You will always need to make sure that you have enough card space. RAW images will take up the maximum amount of pixels and information your camera is capable of, so having a small size data card may not be enough if you're out exploring. Make sure to check how many photos you can get out of your SD card or whatever card you have in RAW mode before deciding to shoot RAW or buying a new bigger card. You can do this by putting your card in your camera, switching your file type over to RAW, and checking the photo number on your screen. Here's a demo of how to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera on here, and you can see in the upper right corner it says I have 1,714 photos left. Now right now it's in JPEG fine mode. If I go in and I scroll up over to how to change my photos over to image quality and I change it to RAW photos, and we go back to the main screen, you can see now I only have 493 photos. You can also look up your specific camera online or check the manual. When shooting RAW, you will have to make sure your computer/post-editing software will be able to read your specific type of camera RAW. Each camera system has a different type of RAW file type, and we will touch more on this in post-editing section, but just keep it in mind. When I shoot RAW on my camera and I want to send it over to my phone wirelessly out in the field, I will have to convert the RAW image to a JPEG because my phone won't read RAW. Most phone apps will not receive RAW files wirelessly from your camera, and most editing apps on smartphones will only edit JPEGs. This is a good thing to keep in mind when you're shooting RAW. Here's how you do it on my personal Fuji camera. We'll be changing our photos from RAW to JPEGs. This photo was taken in RAW, but if I want to send it to my phone, I need to turn it into a JPEG in my camera. Now, not all cameras can do this, of course, but this camera can. So we're going to hit Menu. We're just going to go down to RAW Conversion, hit Select. Basically, I can change the look of it inside this camera. That's a really cool feature for this camera. I'm going to hit Q, and now it's processing. Now I'm going to hit OK Store, and that will now store the new JPEG in my camera. Here are some tips for shooting in JPEG. Sometimes I do shoot in JPEG to save space, time, and editing, and/or posting things quickly over my phone. If you do shoot in JPEG, here are a few tips. When shooting in JPEG, you won't have as much room to adjust exposure settings in post, so I tend to make sure to keep an eye on the histogram. You'll remember in the advanced section and the exposure section. You want to make sure it's a full histogram and even between lights and darks looking like this. Number 2, you will want to make sure you're happy with your white balance and the picture settings. More on white balance later, but keep an eye on your image because you won't have as much room to make changes later in post like you would with a RAW photo. Use JPEGs to shoot a lot of photos at once. Because they're smaller and your camera has less to process, you can use JPEGs to shoot more frames per second and get that perfect shot. Especially in sports, if you want to shoot a lot of photos at once and your camera processor may not be as high or professional, use JPEGs to shoot quickly.